Hello and welcome to Behind the Story. I'm Sebastian Gomes, an executive editor at America Media. With the news of Pope Benedict XVI's death, Catholics around the world are beginning to reflect on his life and his legacy. And not only Catholics, but people of different faiths and other Christian traditions as well. And we're very fortunate to be able to speak with a prominent Anglican theologian and someone who knew Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI, the former Archbishop of Canterbury and a former Master of Magdalen College at Cambridge, Dr. Rowan Williams. For our viewers who may not know, the Archbishop of Canterbury is the leader of the Church of England and is the symbolic head of the Communion of Anglican churches worldwide. So Dr. Williams, thank you very much for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thank you, it's a privilege.
Now, before we get started, please subscribe to our YouTube channel if you haven't already, and comment below. Let us know how you're remembering Pope Benedict XVI today. So, Dr. Williams, you served as the Archbishop of Canterbury from 2002 until 2012, almost the exact same period that Joseph Ratzinger served as Pope of the Catholic Church from 2005 to 2013. And that means there were several formal occasions for the two of you to meet, and we'll get into some of the specific topics related to those meetings and our churches in a bit. But I'm wondering if any one of those encounters was especially meaningful and memorable for you personally that you're recalling on this day.
I suppose what I remember most vividly is the rather domestic moments. The first time I sat down one-to-one with him, the first time we had a private lunch together, and a great deal of pasta and pasta sauce in his private apartments, and also when my family and I were able to welcome him in Lambeth Palace to our own home for tea and cakes. So,
and I think that was the first time that a pope had entered Lambeth Palace, is that correct?
I believe so, yes. And it was a wonderful, wonderful afternoon, which I shall never forget, nor will my family or my staff.
Most of us think about the Pope and talk about the Pope and see the Pope from a distance, but you know, you've had this chance to interact with him one-on-one. What's he like in those personal meetings?
I found him, not surprisingly, rather a shy person. He was very much a German professor in some ways. But I was very pleased to discover that he had a real sense of humor, very quiet and very dry, and that there was a warmth in our encounters, which I always greatly valued, and an honesty. So I found him essentially someone of real personal humility and willingness to listen. Not always the picture people had, I know, but in our personal encounters, I think a great deal of grace.
As a former Archbishop of Canterbury, you exercised a similar ministry to Pope Emeritus Benedict. You led a community of Christians that was very diverse culturally, had a lot of diversity in theological opinion, many internal debates in our own communities, and obviously leading a community of faith in a rapidly changing world. I'm just wondering what it's like to be in that position, and if, because you both operated in that position, there was some camaraderie, if there was some camaraderie between the two of you in that regard.
In many ways, I suppose the two of us would have found it quite difficult to identify anybody else who had quite the same set of stresses and strains. And so I think that did help to create a sense of warmth and friendship between us, even when we were not, as we weren't, in full agreement on things. We recognized the kinds of tension that the other would be feeling. And I think it's also fair to say that we both came from a theological background in which there was a very, very powerful sense that the church, the sacramental fellowship of the church, was something given. It wasn't something you created, invented, something that depended on you. And I think that strong sacramental sense of fellowship we were in, the sense of the body of Christ. That was one of the things which we both found sustained us in our work. And that was one of the things we talked about most often, I suppose, when we talked theology. But I have one memory which perhaps is an answer to two of your questions. And that is just before the canonization of John Henry Newman. This was a time when our Anglican family was particularly fractious and quarrelsome. And I was talking over a meal with Pope Benedict about the canonization, about Newman, and about also the requirement of miracles for canonization. And I remember saying to him, do you think if I asked for the intercession of John Henry Newman to keep the Anglican Communion together for the next 6 months, and it succeeded, that would count towards his canonization? And he looked at me very solemnly and said, yeah, I think that would be a miracle.
That's a wonderful story.
But I mean, he had a sense of humor.
Yeah, I've heard that from other people as well in conversations that we've had since his passing. You've spent a significant amount of your time and energy on interfaith initiatives. I know dialogue and bridge building with people who believe different things is very, very important to you. And I'd like to ask you specifically about the dialogue between the Catholic and Anglican churches, particularly the influence of Pope Emeritus Benedict on that dialogue. The dialogue's been going on for some time. Perhaps before we get into that broader influence, we can look at something very particular that a lot of people point to when they think about this topic, and that is the creation of the Anglican Ordinariates. I think it was early November of 2009, and Pope Benedict issued an apostolic constitution, essentially creating a pathway, an official pathway for Anglicans to enter into full communion with the Catholic Church. And it did so through the establishment of these personal ordinariates, which function a bit like dioceses, and that allowed for Anglicans to, preserve their liturgical and spiritual heritage. This was big news, obviously, and a really important development in the context of much broader ecumenical conversations that have been going on between our churches. You were Archbishop of Canterbury at the time. I'm just wondering what you made of that decision and how, in your mind, that impacted the ecumenical dialogue between our churches.
It's really quite a complicated question, that. And I think there are two things I'd want to underline in response. One is that I think I and many other Anglicans would have been happier if we had been more directly involved in the discussions about this, because it came as a surprise to us. And I think a surprise to some people in the Roman Catholic Church as well. And some of the language about it at the time is a bit exaggerated. There was a UK newspaper which said that the Pope had his tanks on my lawn, which wasn't quite how I saw it. But there was that rather dramatic reception of it. So it would have been good to have a bit more advanced discussion and notice. The other thing I remember saying at the time was, this is a very important pastoral provision for traditionally minded Anglicans who are feeling alienated by some of the directions the Anglican Communion is going in. It's an important pastoral provision. I'm not sure how much it does for the reconciliation of our communions as a whole. And that feeling was shared by people on both sides. So I didn't regard it as some wanted me to, as a great insult or a great provocation. Certainly, I saw it as a pastoral step. Equally, I wasn't sure that it contributed greatly to the real ecumenical challenge, which is of, I think, the reconciliation of real diversity in a single sacramental body. So a complicated episode, but it happened not long before I was due to go to Rome for one of my regular visits to see Pope Benedict. And there were some who said, well, you shouldn't go. This is an act of war. And I said, that's completely ridiculous. I need to go. I need to keep the friendship. And we need to keep the routine discussion between our churches on an even keel. And that's exactly what happened. Together, we set in motion the next round of official talks between our two communions, and the creation of the Ordinariate didn't disturb that. And I think for some people it's been a context where they've flourished, and what can you do but give thanks to God for that? But there is a much bigger task to do for the reconciliation of the two communions.
So you mentioned, the creation of the Ordinariate is a pastoral decision from Pope Benedict, how you interpret it, and obviously you're reflecting on the much broader significance and importance of continuing the ecumenical dialogues that we have between our churches. Can you comment specifically on that, on how Pope Benedict influenced that broader ecumenical movement? This is an evolution, a trajectory that's been developing, since basically the Second Vatican Council with the Catholic Church officially. What was Benedict's contribution to the evolution of that movement, which still has a long way to go?
Well, as I said, the two of us agreed on the next round of official talks with the ARCIC, Anglican Roman Catholic International Commission. We discussed the agenda for that. We knew that we would have to be discussing matters around ethics, about the doctrine of human nature. And I think he was more than willing that that discussion should continue. And he was deeply encouraging of the local initiatives that we took on that front. In my time, we used to have every year a day of recollection, which the Anglican and Roman Catholic bishops would share together. Relations were extremely warm and cordial in the UK between the bishops. And I still wear the ring that was presented to me by Cardinal Murphy O'Connor when he retired, as a sign of our very deep friendship. So there was all of that local work, which I think the Pope was delighted to see. And also there were those significant invitations, for example, to the Assisi event. That was an important moment for many of us of working together. I was received with great generosity and warmth, visiting Rome, being invited to be seated near the sanctuary in various events. And of course, he and I together officiated at Vespers in the Camaldolese monastery of San Gregorio in Rome to mark the millennium of the Camaldolese Benedictine congregation. So there were any number of signs of that mutual respect and consideration, which I think translated into a sense that Pope Benedict was somebody committed to working with other Christians, committed to keeping doors open.
I'd like to move to the Pope's visit to the United Kingdom in 2010. You mentioned that one of your fond memories of him was this personal meeting at the palace with you and your family. That was a very significant papal visit for many reasons. I'm just wondering, there's the famous talk in Westminster Hall that was really iconic of the thought and depth and theological perspective of Pope Benedict XVI. But I'm just wondering, in the context of that visit, there was all the eyeballs of the English-speaking media from around the world were there. There was some controversy about how he was going to be received. What do you remember from that visit, and what do you think, the impact of that visit was? Maybe not only on the Catholic community of England, but on the country as a whole.
There had been, as you say, quite a lot of anxieties beforehand, and quite a lot of rather overheated criticism in the media. And I remember that my colleagues at Lambeth Palace and myself worked quite hard with our opposite numbers in the Cardinal's office to make sure that the visit was as fruitful as possible, and that we could work together on this. But I think you're right in saying that the address in Westminster Hall was possibly the most significant moment of the visit. That was a really unique moment when the Pope addressed the British governing establishment, if you like, directly. And I know what a very great effect it made in terms of, if you like, putting before that very, very diverse group a vision of Christian integrity and spiritual aspiration, which moved a lot of people more than they had expected to be moved. My memory of that is colored by one particular thing. The Lord Speaker, that is the senior person who presides at debates in the House of Lords, was chairing that event. And I was seated behind the lectern along with various other people. And I could see that the Lord Speaker had a set of prepared responses to make after the Pope's address. And as the Pope finished, I could see her putting her prepared remarks aside and responding directly to what he'd said, so that she'd been really arrested and engaged by what he'd said. And that little detail, that moment when she discarded her notes, I think said a lot for the force with which he'd spoken.
You have a new book that's been published called The Way of Saint Benedict, referring to the 6th century saint who wrote this famous rule, monastic rule, that has been a part of our Christian tradition since then. And you argue in that book that the rule is very relevant for today. Saint Benedict is obviously the namesake of Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI. I'm wondering, in light of your scholarship and your personal relationship with Pope Benedict, if you see any commonalities or connections between the two.
I think perhaps the most evident point of contact is that Benedict is, of course, the patron saint of Europe. And I think that Pope Benedict had a very, very strong sense of his mission to and responsibility for Europe, for the spiritual heritage of Europe, but not just as a heritage, something that was at the heart of the integrity of the European vision. For him, the history of Europe was not simply the history of a global power with all sorts of shadows in its past. It was also the history of the engagement of the Christian faith with the cultures of Europe. And he was always deeply, passionately concerned that what the Christian and Catholic faith had given to Europe should not be underestimated or forgotten, swept aside. And I connect that with the rule of St. Benedict because, of course, what you see there is a Christian vision of community, of mutuality, respect, the sense of the sacredness of the person and the distinctness of the person, all these things which for Pope Benedict were of the greatest importance. In one of his early theological books, he says that, I can't remember the exact phrase, but it's something to the effect that each one of us is a name and not a number. And the more people are reduced to numbers, the worse it gets. We have to remember the uniqueness of each person's name. And that's a very Benedictine insight. You connect it with what St. Benedict says in the rule about the different gifts and the different callings of each person, even within a community working together, and how the leader of such a community has to have a deep awareness of that distinctness in order to make them work together. So yes, I think there really was something very Benedictine about the Benedict's vision.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rowan Williams, for taking the time to speak with us today and sharing these insights and these experiences. We really appreciate it.
Well, very welcome.
Dr. Rowan Williams is a former Archbishop of Canterbury and a former Master of Magdalen College at Cambridge. If you haven't already, please subscribe to our channel for more great content on the life and legacy of Pope Benedict XVI. And comment below. Let us know how you're remembering the late Pope today. You can find complete coverage from America at americamagazine.org. Thanks for watching.